From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $80 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. In today's episode, we explore the remarkable journey of the one and only superstar Billy Graham, a man whose impact on the industry forever changed the game. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. From the May 22, 2023 Observer newsletter, superstar Billy Graham passes away. AEW Collision Show officially announced. By Observer staff. Eldridge Wayne Coleman, better known as superstar Billy Graham, seemingly lived multiple lives and nearly died multiple deaths. The wrestler whose influence changed the business completely had been suffering health issues on and off for decades. There were near-death experiences from drug overdoses, health ailments that he had believed were linked to his heavy usage of steroids, liver failure that he survived with a 2002 transplant, and multiple later issues, and there was even a period in 1981 when rumors spread and were reported in two major newspapers of his death, and speculated on in both bodybuilding and wrestling magazines. It was a strange paradox. I don't think anyone would have expected that Graham would live to be 1 month short of his 80th birthday. Yet, he had survived so many near-death experiences that even as the reports got worse and worse in recent months during his hospitalization, those who followed him had seen it so many times that it was almost like this was just another incident. There was the feeling that somehow, like all the other incidents, no matter how they read, the end result would be the same and he'd survive once again. On May 15th, Valerie Coleman, his wife and the almost saintly cornerstone of his life for about 45 years, since she was 19, said that doctors had told her that it was time to remove him from life support and there was nothing left they could do for him. She refused. She'd seen him come close to death many times and always come back. She was deeply religious and believed in miracles. Religion helped Valerie get through all of Billy's turmoil. Billy was heavily into religion at times in his life. It's where he originally developed his gift of gab before pro wrestling. But he had so many issues that things wavered. Valerie never wavered. She still believed a miracle would happen, and why not? It did every time before. 2 days later, a person who, at least when it came to outside the ring dress, look, and interviews, was among the most influential wrestlers of all time and certainly the most of the 70s, passed away with Valerie and his daughter, Capella, named after the star, right there. You could very easily argue that not in the ring, but as far as a character and personality outside the ring, the superstar Billy Graham character was the most influential, and certainly one of the most influential of modern times. Here are facts. With no superstar Billy Graham, there is no Hulk Hogan. And Hogan may be the most important character of this generation. There may have been a Ric Flair, but he would be very different outside the ring than this Ric Flair. There would have definitely been a Dusty Rhodes, but not what Dusty Rhodes ended up being. Vince McMahon would probably have been the owner of the WWF, but without the prototype of what a sports entertainer should be created by Graham that became his vision would have been very different. Plus, there would be no Hulk Hogan to execute it. Would steroid use in wrestling have been as plentiful? It absolutely would have existed. It existed well before Billy Graham, and plenty of higher-level bodybuilders did and would have done pro wrestling, but none got over to his level or had his influence on changing the game. His legacy is far from pretty. One of the top two heels of the 70s with a chic, absolutely. An excellent drawing card for a couple of runs, no question. Charming and likable, certainly at times. Almost possessed by his demons at other times, inarguable. Sometimes honest. Often not. The concept of the characters he copied him and that he created generated hundreds of millions of dollars. And for a time he was among the highest paid athletes in the country. But it was a very short window, and for most of his life, he was broke, always looking for a big score. But he never found that big score. Graham had been hospitalized since the start of the year. He had lost more than 80 pounds and had infections in his ears, skull, and sinus cavity. Over the last several weeks, he was battling kidney and other organ failures. He had lost his hearing due to the infection. Superstar Graham MSG main events. December 15, 1975. While not a main event, Graham debuted pinning Dominic DeNucci in a supposed MSG record of 9 seconds with a running knee to the back when DeNucci had his back turned at the bell. Sammartino beat Ivan Koloff in the main event to keep the title. When Graham came out, it was said that no newcomer had gotten the kind of reaction he got, and because of his physique and his presence, people saw him as a real threat to Sammartino. Sammartino mostly sold big based on the idea of fans knowing he'd shut up the big-mouthed heels. They rarely thought it was possible he would lose, But the buzz in the crowd when they announced Sammartino versus Graham for the next show was even more than for previous months with Koloff, who was Sammartino's most hated rival of all, stemming from Koloff's 1971 title win. January 22, 1976, Graham beat Sammartino via countout with a sellout in advance. February 2, 1976, Sammartino pinned Graham in 1755 before 25,600 fans with both a sold-out Madison Square Garden and Felt Forum, Hulu Arena, for closed circuit. March 29, 1976, Sammartino and Tony Parisi beat Graham and Koloff via countout in a 2-of-3 fall main event before 21,000 fans. May 16, 1977, Graham, after beating Sammartino for the title, pinned Gorilla Monsoon before 17,189 fans, one of his two non-sellout main events. June 27, 1977, Graham went to a double DQ with Sammartino in a show that sold out MSG and the Felt Forum, with 25,000 fans and reportedly another 4,000 turned away and couldn't get tickets. August 1, 1977, Graham went to another double DQ with Sammartino with 25,000 fans selling out MSG and the Felt Forum the second time in a row, with Gorilla Monsoon as referee. August 29, 1977, Graham pinned Ivan Putski to retain the title in a sold-out MSG and with 3,000 more at the Felt Forum, meaning 23,000 total. September 26, 1977, Dusty Rhodes beat Graham via countout in 10:58 in a show that sold out Madison Square Garden and nearly sold out the Felt Forum with 24,000. This is the match used in the current Cody Rhodes angle of how his father beat the champion in the picture in the house but never got the title. Rhodes got his hand raised, fans thought it was a title change, only to be told a title can't change hands on a countout. October 24, 1977, Graham pinned Rhodes in a Texas death match before about 25,000 fans with a sold-out MSG and Felt Forum, selling out both well in advance. Many major New York celebrities that never attended wrestling shows attended to see Graham versus Rhodes. November 21, 1977, Graham beat Peter Maivia via countout. This was Graham's only MSG main event that wasn't a sellout aside from Monsoon, drawing 17,914. December 19, 1977, Mil Mascaras beat Graham via ref stoppage due to blood before a sellout crowd with the Felt Forum opened and 24,000 total. In those days in WWF, the title did not change hands via ref stoppage. January 23, 1978, Graham beat Mascaras via DQ. The finish saw Bob Backlund attack Graham to set up their title match on the next show. This was a sellout, but they didn't open the Felt Forum because it didn't sell out until late. The planned finish was Graham winning by pin. Mascaras refused to do the job. Graham was always upset because he had put Mascaras over in California many times and on the prior MSG show, but Mascaras still refused to put him over the day of the show. February 20, 1978, Backlund pinned Graham to win the title in 14:51. This was a double sellout of MSG and the Felt Forum at a giant match. It was well known ahead of time that Backlund was the new big star and he was winning the title on this show. March 20, 1978, Graham's rematch for the title saw him win via ref stoppage for blood before 24,000 fans, a sold-out MSG, and a nearly sold-out Felt Forum. April 24, 1978, Backlund beat Graham to blow off the feud, winning a cage match that sold out both MSG and the Felt Forum with 25,000 fans, and setting the all-time U.S. indoor gate record for pro wrestling. July 24, 1978, Graham beat Rhodes via DQ on a double bill with Backlund vs. George Steele and another sellout as well as a nearly full Felt Forum with 24,000 total. August 28, 1978, Rhodes beat Graham in a bull rope match as part of a double bill with Backlund vs. Koloff with a sellout and the Felt Forum opened for the overflow but wasn't sold out. October 23, 1978, Sammartino beat Graham via blood stoppage in 15:09 as part of a double bill with Backlund vs. Ladd and a sellout crowd. October 4, 1982, Graham returned as a Kung Fu master and beat Backlund via DQ before a sellout crowd. November 22, 1982, Backlund and Graham wrestled to a double countout before a sellout crowd. December 28, 1982, Backlund beat Graham in a lumberjack match before a third straight sellout to blow off the feud. October 16, 1987, Graham beat Butch Reed in a cage match just before he was pulled from active wrestling due to injuries in his final MSG appearance before 19,700 paid fans. It was the largest crowd in the building since August 25, 1986, which included Hulk Hogan title defenses during that period against Kamala twice, Harley Race twice, and One Man Gang. Pro wrestling history, and the product, would be completely different without Graham. Key creative minds from Vince McMahon to Paul Heyman were either inspired by him or became fans because of him. The number of wrestlers who copied him in some form, like Hogan, Flair, Rhodes, Jesse Ventura, Austin Idol, Scott Steiner, Triple H, and dozens if not hundreds of others were people who changed the very fabric of the history of the business. In the Midwest and Northeast, and perhaps other places as well, his ability to draw in kids who saw him as the ultimate in being cool probably led them to weight training and in some cases fitness. And while in his prime he was the golden god, the looks, the body, the fan, the gab, he spent most of his life very unhealthy, probably because of the very thing that made him look so special. Many people, myself included, had their lives changed because his charisma and promos drew us to pro wrestling. It's a somber and sad feeling looking back to my childhood, in the sense it is possible my life would have ended up the same without him drawing me to pro wrestling in California with his promos. I got into it after a lot of my friends of the same age did, and that was before Billy Graham arrived in Northern California. They all watched wrestling religiously beforehand. Graham was, as Scott Steiner would say, my hookup. Perhaps he drew me in more deeply and thus I became a fan and reporter at this level for life. And perhaps without him, even if I watched wrestling with my friends, it would have been the NFL, NBA or baseball that would have been my real passion and future. It's also possible everything would have been largely the same. Perhaps Heyman would have still been a wrestling fan if he hadn't seen Graham talk him into the business as a kid watching WWF television in the 70s, before he conceptually changed so much about the business. Perhaps not. We do know there would be no Hogan character the way he was without superstar Graham. Hogan's act, and his look, was largely taken from Graham and Austin Idol, and Idol was really one of the many who bleached their hair, got muscular and copied Graham's promos, which Graham himself copied from Muhammad Ali. So what Hogan copied from Idol was copying from Graham as well. Ventura was so much a copy of Graham that one day Vern Gagne called up Graham to return to the AWA, telling him that he's got a guy who does superstar Billy Graham better than Billy Graham. While Ric Flair copied his in-ring from Ray Stevens, and some aspects from Buddy Rogers, the color, the hair, the idea of the body, and the promos, and came from Graham. And what Flair copied from Rhodes, that was what Rhodes learned from Graham in the early 1970s when both were in the AWA. Rhodes took the heel Graham interview style and wardrobe, and combined it with his Texas cowboy persona as the top heel in Florida, and later the top babyface. Rhodes later became, along with Bruno Sammartino, probably Graham's two biggest career rivals. McMahon saw in Graham the future of pro wrestling, with the charisma and the look. Graham was past his prime by 1984, when McMahon went national, which is why McMahon used to remark that Graham came 10 years too early. Hogan was his guy, and Hogan was the guy, because he was a bigger version of the Graham character that was the vision of McMahon for what the guy to build around is supposed to be. In fact, the McMahon attempt to change the very term of wrestlers to superstars came because of Graham being called superstar, with the idea that he wanted wrestlers to be not sweaty, fit guys exchanging holds, but comic book superheroes, basically Billy Graham, big, muscular, and colorful. Obviously that look led to health problems with many wrestlers. Graham blamed steroids for all of his health issues and was outspoken against their use by the 1990s. While he appeared sincere in that belief to me, there is no doubt that he always craved the spotlight that he lost when wrestling ended. He had periods where he got a lot of media attention from being the guy with all the health problems from steroids, a walking warning signal that something really bad is happening in sports. And then it faded. He sued McMahon at one point for his health problems, as well as steroid manufacturers. It was unsuccessful because Graham started taking steroid around 1965 to 1967, before he was even a pro wrestler. During his career as an active wrestler, from 1970 to 1987, he spent maybe 5 or 6 years total working for the WWF/WWF. I think Graham and his attorneys thought they had a multi-million-dollar case. They had access to government records that showed so many of the WWF stars, including Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, and other of the biggest stars, getting shipments from steroid distributor Dr. George Zaharian of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They thought they could use that information and the threat to release it to the media to get a big settlement. McMahon didn't settle. And that leverage was gone when others got copies of the records and they were released. During that time I spoke to both Graham and Vince McMahon, for a time caught in the middle. Jerry McDevitt basically flatlined Graham's case. He portrayed Billy in the worst light possible, and WWF magazine even did a hit piece on Graham, the likes of which they never did on anyone, even Ultimate Warrior. Actually, much of what Graham said about the steroid use in the company was accurate, and Sammartino would corroborate it. Even with what from the outside would seem like Graham and McDevitt would be horrible enemies, Graham always told me how much he admired McDevitt, thinking he was a super attorney. McDevitt always said he personally liked Graham, and respected what he did. But his job was to smash him, and he did. He told me if the circumstances were different, he'd have loved to have represented Graham in suing the steroid manufacturers. McMahon, of course, had many bad things to say given they were in a court fight, and Graham had nothing good to say about McMahon at the time. McMahon would portray him as a blackmailer and con man, and use legitimate credibility problems to obfuscate some very legitimate things Graham was saying that, aside from Sammartino and a few others, almost nobody at the time would say publicly. But he did have a soft spot for superstar Billy Graham of the 70s, who was the epitome of his vision to change pro wrestling as far as the look of the talent to more big colorful bodybuilders and characters and less technical wrestlers. He readily conceded that it was a mistake when his father took the title off Graham in 1978 for Bob Backlund, and that Graham should have been turned babyface and had a longer championship run. Graham went into depression losing the title, essentially because he drew so well as champion and thought by the rules of wrestling in the 70s, that meant he should keep the championship. Graham was the biggest drawing card in the entire business in both 1977 and 1978 after being number 3 behind Sammartino and Antonio Inoki, which was the year of Inoki versus Muhammad Ali and Willem Ruska. In 1976, the year the decision was made for him to replace Sammartino as WWF champion. He was told by Eddie Graham and Vince McMahon Sr. that Sammartino wanted out as champion and was told months ahead of time that he would win the title on April 30, 1977, in Baltimore, from Sammartino, and would lose it on February 20, 1978, in Madison Square Garden, to Bob Backlund. Winning the championship that only 5 others had held in its 14-year history should have been the best moment of his career. But that night he was more worried about getting out of Baltimore alive after he would put his feet on the ropes and do the unthinkable, pin Sammartino in a WWF title match. It was something only one man, Ivan Koloff, had done in the 14 years since Sammartino had been the man. The good part is the crowd was sold out with 12,000 fans. Graham got out alive, and business boomed with him on top. He defended the WWF title not only in the territory, but in a number of major NWA cities. He once did a 60 minutes draw at the Orange Bowl in Miami in a title versus title match with Harley Race in front of 12,000 fans in a rainstorm. The territory had been built around heel managers bringing in new heels to face the babyface champion. It was a system that had been used since the rise of Sammartino in 1963 and was the basic foundation until the end of the Hulk Hogan Championship era. But Graham drew so well as champion, and he was brought up in a business where it was all about what was working at the box office. But Vince McMahon's father made his plans and was going to stick with them. 2 days before the planned title loss was the biggest match up to that point in the history of Philadelphia. Graham was defending against Sammartino in a cage match. The fans in Philadelphia knew that Sammartino never lost clean, past the one time Graham cheated to beat him for the title and Graham never was able to do it again, and the 1971 match with Koloff that he avenged many times over. Sammartino had come close to beating Graham, and the cage match was the one title loss Graham couldn't escape. Of course, they didn't know that Sammartino, no matter what he said in his promos, did not want the title. In those days, most tickets were sold the day of the event. On this day that wasn't the case, as 19,500 tickets were sold well in advance, just as the two had done in their prior meeting. But this was much bigger. The newscasts on television, who never covered wrestling no matter how big the interest was, all covered this, noting to stay away from the Spectrum and that it was sold out and you couldn't get a ticket, not from scalpers, not from anyone. Still, it was one of the biggest traffic jams in the city of that era, because however many thousands, the low estimate being 6,000, ignored the news on television and the radio, and had to find a way to get into the building. There's no telling how many people it could have drawn if it wasn't February and they had tried a stadium. Graham actually talked to me more about this specific match than any match of his career. Here he was, the biggest drawing heel in the business by far, facing the legendary babyface, and with twists and turns they could always go back to this match and do incredible business because that was the Sammartino vs. Graham WWF title match magic. Even the night before in Pittsburgh, Graham vs. Putski had sold out the Civic Arena, with more than 16,000 fans. And both men saw that Graham's run in business was still growing. They were doing a fluke finish, rare in a cage match, but the only way they could do it, where Sammartino would pound on Graham for most of the match, and then throw a punch that would knock Graham out the cage door to the floor, and thus Graham was the winner in a heated 7:43. Before the match, Sammartino, who wasn't aware Graham was losing the title in 2 days, expressed disbelief. Once Backlund was champion, Sammartino couldn't challenge, and his facing Graham and Sammartino's limited appearances meant giant payoffs by the standard of that time. Graham's plan was for Sammartino to accidentally injure him, trying to work everyone, and thus miss the MSG match where he was to lose. The hope was that McMahon Sr. would see what most of his talent saw and that this was hardly the time to change the title. But McMahon had crafted his plan back in 1976 and been executing it for a year. Deep down, everyone knew Backlund was beating Graham for the title for months. They just didn't know when. Of course, Graham backfired on his own plan, working out of the territory the next day at Maple Leaf Garden in Toronto, where he retained the title over Edward Carpentier. He then showed up in MSG, told Vince Sr. that his knee was blown out and there was no way he could work. Graham's reputation as a con was hardly a secret, and Sr. never would have bought the knee injury suddenly on this day to begin with. But unbeknownst to Graham, he also knew Graham had worked the night before in Toronto. He basically told Graham that knee injury or not, he's going in the ring and putting over Backlund. Graham remained a huge draw, both chasing Backlund and working with people like Rhodes and Sammartino in matches that were probably bigger draws than the title matches on top, and near the top with the other babyfaces. But the depression got to him and he was never the same. Howard Finkel, who ring announced for a generation, would always say that the hottest crowds he ever ring announced for were the Sammartino versus Graham matches in Madison Square Garden. While St. Louis was one of the best paying cities in the country, especially for headliners, Graham wasn't a fan because the television was almost all wrestling with very little promo time. He felt without the promo time you couldn't get the match or over, but St. Louis was one of the best drawing cities in the country. Once Graham, for whatever reason, missed a main event. Sam Mushnick, the promoter, was so mad about the no-show that he took Graham's photo down from the office and told Larry Matuzik, his assistant, that as far as St. Louis goes, Billy Graham is dead. After his run in WWF was over, he went to a few places, including Tennessee, where his magazine covers and fame as WWF champion was used to create the CWA World Championship that Jerry Jarrett used as the top belt. Then in 1980, he wrestled mostly in Houston on Friday nights for Paul Bosch. And he didn't wrestle at all. He disappeared, got on what he called the heaviest steroid regimen of his life. He bulked up to 325 pounds and was invited to compete in that year's World's Strongest Man competition, which was a major series of events that would air over a couple of months on network television. He showed personality, such as in a lift of silver dollars. He tried to steal the silver dollars. He was injured in the competition and wound up in 7th place behind the younger lifters who had learned to specialize in the event, won by future pro wrestler Bill Kazmaier. Graham did place second and even beat Kazmaier in the battery hold. But he was not the same superstar Billy Graham people knew. He was obviously bulked up, had shaved his trademark thinning bleached blonde hair, dumped the sideburns and grew a mustache. The voice was the same and he cut great promos during the season, but the cool look that was his trademark wasn't there. He was called Superstar Billy Graham, a pro wrestler, but he looked completely different from the Superstar Billy Graham that rocked the biggest arenas in the world. He went through depression, and to him, that Superstar Billy Graham died as his issues got worse. He was living in Phoenix, digging underground sprinklers. He didn't want to be around wrestling. And he didn't want the Superstar Billy Graham, who was WWF champion, to be a guy digging sprinklers. He had no job skills past pro wrestling, and he at the time couldn't bear to do pro wrestling. And then he died. Or so the rumor was. Because he had disappeared from wrestling, the rumors in both wrestling newsletters, wrestling magazines, and bodybuilding publications was that he might have died from cancer. Nobody reported that he did, just everyone heard that, and nobody knew where he was. Gorilla Monsoon at the time did a column in the Philadelphia Journal, one of the daily papers there, reporting Graham had died on November 4, 1981, in his home of Paradise Valley, Arizona. At around the same time, Art Rosenbaum, a legendary sports columnist in the San Francisco Chronicle, ran a story about steroids in sports, which were known to all the athletes and the gym rats, but really not to the fans, and even sports people were naive to it. Rosenbaum wrote about the side effects, and noted hearing from John Swensky, a former wrestler who later became a promoter in San Jose, who mentioned to him that Graham, who had worked in San Jose regularly early in his career, was so muscular he made Arnold Schwarzenegger look like Twiggy, a famous thin female model of the time, and that Graham had died from cancer due to steroids. Graham found out about the Monsoon story and called him up, telling him he was alive. Monsoon would never write a retraction. Billy's death was short-lived. A few weeks later, Graham was announced as being on the January 1982 tour for New Japan Pro Wrestling. So it went from maybe Billy died, to he did die, to he was clearly alive but looked different within a relatively short period of time. He did some indies and the McMahons brought him back to WWF in August 1982 for a run with Backlund. They were expecting Superstar Billy Graham, the blonde Adonis bodybuilder. Instead, they got a much smaller, almost sickly looking at times, particularly compared to what people remembered of superstar Billy Graham, at least in comparison to what he used to look like. Bald-headed older-looking guy who did still have good-sized arms. He wore karate pants and a black belt and claimed that in the time he was gone, he had studied martial arts and was the martial arts champion of the world, playing off the popularity of Kung Fu, a popular TV show. Graham did no flashy martial arts moves or kicks, but would throw chops. He was not impressive at all in the ring or with a gimmick. Still, he was Billy Graham and he could talk, and he hated Backlund for taking his title, both in storyline and for real. He did an angle where he stole the title belt and smashed it and tore it to pieces, with the idea that if he couldn't wear the physical belt, nobody else could either. The new Graham didn't have the charisma like the old Graham, but his run with Backlund was largely a box office success because his name was so strong. Except in Philadelphia, where all the fans knew that he died and this was an imposter superstar Billy Graham. The matches weren't good. But Graham was never a great worker in the ring. He was all about the look and the promos, which set the stage for a lot of the WWF main events during the Hogan era. But Graham was more than a wrestler. He was a high school track athlete at a powerhouse school who at one point was training to be an Olympic decathlete. He also competed in boxing and bodybuilding. His actual debut in Madison Square Garden was not as superstar Billy Graham, but as heavyweight boxer Wayne Coleman, where he lost a 3-round undercard fight by knockout on October 21, 1966. He scored 3 knockdowns in the first 2 rounds but was knocked out on the third, got a $150 payoff. He went to his hotel and passed out. At 3 a.m. he woke up, thinking he'd overslept his Madison Square Garden debut, but saw $150 in cash on the dresser and looked in the mirror and saw his face all puffy. He had no recollection of the fight. He never boxed again, but he got into fights all the time back home as a bouncer. In 1961, he won the West Division of the Teenage Mr. America contest. This was years before he discovered steroids or before steroids were all that prevalent in bodybuilding except at the top level. He fell in with the wrong crowd and whatever potential he had as a shot putter or decathlete was squandered. He ended up with religious revivalists that would go from town to town, with him doing feats of strength, because of the power he would day the Lord gave him. It was this period where he learned the verbal skills and smooth talking patterns that served him so well as a pro wrestler. Then he discovered steroids. Before all his injuries that cost him inches in height, Wayne Coleman was about 6'4" and 275 or so pounds with the bodybuilder look and powerlifter strength. Steve Strong said at the nightclubs where he bounced that people would come just to see a guy so big and powerful because this wasn't an era where people like that walked around. He wanted to combine bodybuilding with wrestling, and he won Best Arms at a 1975 Mr. America contest while he was in WWF the first time. This was not the big Mr. America contest, but a contest by a smaller promotion that used the name. But he got a pinched nerve right before the contest in a wrestling match, and thus he lost size in one of his arms. Because of that, after that point would often do one-arm poses and focus on his good side. Graham always would look back and wish that he would have focused more on his diet, because he loved bodybuilding and never reached what he thought was his ultimate potential. The claim, likely by himself, was that he bench pressed 605 pounds, just off the world record at the time of 617 pounds by Pat Casey. Of course, competition bench pressing in strict form and gym bench pressing are different. He had no giant numbers under meet conditions, so the idea he came close to a world record is more than speculative. But under any circumstances, he was phenomenally strong for his era and could reasonably be called one of the strongest men in the country during the late 60s and early 70s. With his size and strength, and while you would never know it from his wrestling, he was a great track athlete in high school. Bob Luke, a bouncer he knew in Phoenix who became a star in the CFL with the Calgary Stampeders, suggested he come up with him to play pro football. Keep in mind he hadn't played any football since his freshman year of high school. He tried out with the Stampeders and was traded to the Montreal Alouettes, where he played in games but with his lack of football experience, was marginal at best on the field. He got his contract and playing time based on being so impressive physically and athletic that coaches thought he could learn football. But he was so far behind in football experience that it didn't happen. He ended up being let go later in the season, but having played in the CFL did help him get into Stampede wrestling because Stu Hart liked people who had played real sports. He then, through another friend, got invited to the Oakland Raiders AFL training camp in 1968, but tore his Achilles tendon in the preseason. He ended up in Los Angeles, where he was the training partner of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Franco Columbu, two of the best bodybuilders in the world. During the early part of his wrestling career, he would train and be good friends with Schwarzenegger, and knew all the bodybuilding stars of the era like Dave Draper, Frank Zane, Ed Corney, and the like. He was featured in the magazines in the early 60s and on occasion in the late 60s and early 70s, including a famous photo of Schwarzenegger watching him do a 585-pound bench press at the original Gold's Gym in Santa Monica. Schwarzenegger was the godfather of his daughter Capella, and Rhodes was the godfather of son Joey, who was born with double pneumonia and an enlarged heart. Luke had started wrestling for Stu Hart and called him, saying he was having a great time and making money as a pro wrestler. Luke told Stu Hart that his buddy had experience, has 22-inch arms and could bench 605. So he drove from Phoenix to Calgary. He met Stu Hart, who was fascinated by the size of his arms. Hart would tell me the story about it was a freezing January day and Big Wayne Coleman showed up after driving from Phoenix, warmed up with a set or two, and he couldn't believe that he then put on 550-pound bench press on the bench and pressed it, something Stu had never seen anyone do. Billy would tell the same story and say it was 600 pounds. Stu then tricked him into letting Hart put on a hold, and all those stories you would hear about the dungeon came true. Graham may have been the biggest and strongest guy that Hart stretched, but he would tell people it was much harder than most of the football players he'd do that to because of his powerful arms and massive frame. It was the start of a wrestling career. He'd arm wrestle fans, something he had done as a bouncer. He challenged anyone in the crowd to put up $100, and if he couldn't put their arm down in 10 seconds, he'd give them back their $100 and pay them $100 for every second past 10. He never lost. He was going to put down anyone in the crowd just via strength unless they were a competitive arm wrestler. Once a competitive arm wrestler showed up and Graham knew all the cheating tricks and cheated to beat him. He got his start in the ring with the idea of two CFL players in a tag team with Angelo Mosca. He drove to Calgary in a new Lincoln Continental that impressed everyone until he was repossessed. Later, when he was one of the top stars in wrestling, he sent Stu a present for starting his career, a color TV. Stu opened the box, saw the TV, and then noted it said property of Holiday Inn, as Billy had apparently stolen it from a hotel he was staying in. Later in 1970, he was back in Phoenix and ran into Dr. Jerry Graham, a wrestling legend whose drinking and eating cost him his career for the most part. But as a trivia note, Dr. Jerry Graham was the favorite wrestler of teenage Vince McMahon. The two actually met on the night of Billy Graham's debut in Calgary. Jerry wasn't working for Stu but was in town because when he had worked for him previously, he had fathered a girl and then left. He'd returned to Calgary because he wanted to take custody of her from his ex-wife. He took a cab to the Hart house at 7 a.m. on a Friday morning. He walked into the house. Believe it not, the Hart house was never locked and anyone could come in at any time. Went into the kitchen and started screaming for Stu, who was upstairs sleeping with Helen. Stu saw it was Jerry Graham, made him coffee, and Jerry, who was drunk, told Stu he needed his help to kidnap his daughter. Stu told him he couldn't get involved in something like that and told Jerry not to do it because he'd end up arrested. Jerry then took a cab, with Abdullah the butcher, to his ex-wife's house, and her father showed up and started attacking Jerry with a broom, and then the police came and arrested Graham and Abdullah. Stu then had to bail them out. Jerry met Billy that night in the dressing room as a drunk Jerry, who had gone to the bathroom in his pants, leaving a streak both in his pants and on chairs he sat in. As a rib when they shook hands, and Billy squeezed him so hard Jerry screamed in pain. Jerry Graham saw the size of Wayne Coleman and away back in. Jerry had done a brother tag team with Eddie Graham in the 50s that was legendary in the Northeast. After the team split up, Eddie teamed with another fake brother, Luke Graham, with lesser success. He sold Mike LaBelle on the idea of the Graham brothers. He told Wayne Coleman to come up with a first name, and he immediately, based on his religion background, said Billy Graham. He got his first real push when leaving to work for Roy Shire, who put Graham in a tag team with Pat Patterson, where they became NWA World Tag Team Champions, feuding with Ray Stevens and Peter Maivia. He had several Cow Palace main events as tag team champions as well as in a singles feud with Stevens as U.S. champion. Shire favored great workers, using mostly shorter guys. He billed Graham as 6'7" and 285 pounds, and Graham called himself the true spirit of America, doing a heel hippie-type gimmick with colorful costuming. His big break came in 1972, when Stevens told Vern Gagne to bring him into the AWA. After the popular musical Jesus Christ Superstar, he became Superstar Billy Graham. He took the Midwest by storm, and he was able to bring in new fans while the loaded-up roster led to the strongest box office period that part of the country would have. It was the famous boom period in the Midwest with Graham as a heel against the Crusher, Ken Patera, Wahoo McDaniel, Ivan Putski, and others. He did gimmicked Olympic weightlifting contests with Patera, who had competed in the 1972 Olympics. They would start with real weights of 225 pounds doing clean and jerks, and then use gimmick weights to get over 400 pounds, which was and still is an incredible clean and jerk, ending with Graham faking a back injury, Patera supposedly lifting 505 pounds for 2 reps, and Graham throwing chalk in his eyes. He'd do arm wrestling matches where he'd flatten jobbers until McDaniel, and in a repeat of the angle, Crusher would challenge him on TV. They would be on the verge of winning and he'd turn over the table and bloody them up. The singles feuds did huge business, as well as a tag feuds with Crusher and Wahoo or other babyface partners against Ivan Koloff and Graham. Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch were a star tag team, and Rhodes studied him. Ric Flair was just starting out and idolized him and befriended him. Flair drove Graham everywhere, or would pick him up at the airport. Everyone wanted to talk and dress and look like superstar Billy Graham. Graham frequently drew big crowds, challenging Verne Gagne for the AWA title during that run. Graham worked with all the top babyfaces, but worked far less with Billy Robinson than the other top faces. He loved working with Crusher because Crusher was so over they could do a simple match. It wasn't pretty big. People loved their older Midwestern barroom brawler firing back at the younger big muscle man who talked so big. Regarding Robinson, Graham told me that he tried to avoid him because Robinson hated bodybuilders, football players and powerlifters, and he was all three. He said he was so scared because of Robinson's reputation that before their first match, he taped up razors that you'd use for blading on his fists and told Robinson that if he tried to hurt him, he'd slice him up. He said he actually never had problems with Robinson, but still didn't like it because of the style clash, as Robinson wanted to wrestle and he wasn't good in that environment. It was this run where his Ali-inspired catchphrases began. I'm the man of the hour. The man with the power. Too sweet to be sour. What you see is what you get, and, looking down his trunks, and what you can't see is better yet. I dine on T-bone steaks and barbell plates, and I'm sweeter than a chocolate cake. I'm going to make your back crack, your knees freeze, and your liver quicker. I'm the man with the world's largest arms and the world's largest charms. He would talk about his kaleidoscope pants, say to announcer Marty O'Neill, you look like a banana peel, and flex his biceps in front of O'Neill's face and talk about how his biceps were bigger than O'Neill's entire head. He had the biggest run of his career outside the WWF during this period. But being from Arizona, he grew to hate the weather. He ended up moving to Dallas, and was such an attraction that Verne Gagne would fly him in from Dallas for his shows for a time. He also did a babyface turn in the AWA that was a success, as the people were always clamoring to cheer for him, but he was a bigger draw as a heel against the legendary faces. When I knew him, Graham would note that he made really good money in the AWA, $90,000 a year in the early 70s would rank him with the top paid athletes in sports, and made about $200,000 the year he was WWF champion. But he didn't save and lamented that while he did well in Florida and was a main eventer everywhere, he felt it was the AWA and WWF runs that really made his career. He was most proud of his record of selling out Madison Square Garden 20 times in the 22 shows he main evented. Only a few men in history, and nobody since Backlund, had that many sellouts in MSG. Nobody had a percentage of sellouts of main events even close to him. But even so, Graham always conceded being the second best MSG draw of the era, saying even he wasn't at the level of Sammartino. But he was always resentful of Backlund following him. Backlund had a nearly 6-year run on top, and far more sellouts than Graham did because he had so many main events. Backlund was a success and a far better in-ring wrestler, although not nearly as charismatic, and the two couldn't have been more different on promos or persona. Backlund was going to be less of a problem, and Vince's father wanted the formula of the babyface champion. On his first run in 1975, Graham, Ernie Ladd and Ivan Koloff banded together as the three top heels and told Vince McMahon Sr. they were leaving if they didn't get main event money for all of their shows. Graham noted doing shows for Jim Crockett in much smaller cities and smaller crowds and getting as good or better payoffs than working in WWF in big cities. McMahon would pay the title challenger well and the other guys significantly less. Graham, Ladd and Koloff argued that they were main event guys everywhere they'd go, and all deserved to be paid as such. At another point, Graham and Koloff tried to start their own promotion in Southern California against Mike LaBelle, which cost them both a lot of money, and it never really got off the ground. After the run with Backlund for the title, Graham bounced around basically on his big name. After a few years, he decided to bring back the colorful garb and the old-style promos, and the bald-headed return of superstar Billy Graham, the living legend, era started. Vince McMahon brought him back in 1986. His hip was already shot. His ankle was going as well. The belief was he hid the hip injury, and then the hip went out in one of his first matches back. The idea was for WWF to pay for his hip surgery, which they did and filmed the surgery to promote a big comeback when he healed. But when he returned, Vince took money out of his check until the price of the surgery was covered, because that's how pro wrestling worked at the time. Still, he main evented a show in Madison Square Garden in 1987 against Butch Reed, which was a feud but hardly a main event feud. But it was still Graham in MSG, and he got his 19th legitimate MSG sellout. But his body was shot and they did an angle where one-man gang gave him a big splash on the floor, and his career as an active wrestler was over. His last actual mock was November 7, 1987, in St. Louis against Reed. Graham was tried out as a manager of Don Morocco, and later as a television announcer. The thought that his being such a great talker would work in those roles, especially after how well Jesse Ventura worked out as an announcer. Graham was let go, and bitter, feeling there were others who weren't nearly as big stars as he was, nor as important to the changing of the game, that McMahon kept around. He did a television news broadcast in Los Angeles talking about his own health, as he was battling a vascular necrosis in his hip and ankle, which he attributed to steroids. This left him with a fused foot. He was also unable to give Valerie children, which she so badly wanted. He loved to train in the gym, but his mobility was bad, so moving was a chore, and without the steroids, and being nearly 50 or older, he couldn't get anywhere near the response and had to use what he called baby weights. He said that as an early steroid user, the doctors told him that they had just discovered a vascular necrosis, basically bone death, was a new side effect from steroids. Because of Graham, that was talked about some in the 90s, but decades later, with far more people having done steroids, the steroids leading to a vascular necrosis theories never materialized. In the 90s, Graham's health was failing. His body retained more than 50 pounds of water, mostly in his midsection. His liver was failing. I saw a photo of his liver when it was removed and it was shocking. Graham would tell the story that it was a photo finish, in the sense his liver was failing when a 26-year-old girl named Katie who died in a car accident was an organ donor, and he got a new liver. He would say it was a miracle in that if he only had days left to live at the time of his transplant. His doctors didn't concur with the photo finish and the days left, but the liver probably gave him a good 20 more years of life. He had to take anti-rejection drugs and numerous other expensive medications, and he lived basically destitute at times, bringing on depression which caused severe mood swings. Valerie, always by his side, even was turned on at one point. In 2010 he told people he had maybe 1 year to live unless he got another liver transplant. His doctor stated a year later that his advanced fibrosis could be early liver cirrhosis, but he could live for 2 more years if he used the drug interferon to slow his hepatitis C, and kept his weight under control, yet he lived another 12 years, which is one of the reasons people started thinking that when he'd be hospitalized and near death, that somehow he would always pull through even until the past week. A year later he was diagnosed with 3rd-stage liver disease and cirrhosis of his new liver. In 2013 he was hospitalized with double pneumonia and possible heart failure. In 2014 he had more liver complications. He had issues with internal bleeding in 2016, and had several toes amputated in 2022. He had many other issues, including being in incredible pain when the artificial hip he got in 1986 dislocated. At first, his autobiography was only going to be released in paperback, because Fred Blassie's book didn't do well. He raised a stink there, telling his WW liaison and the book company that he was way more over than Blassie. So the book got his hardcover release, and the book was very honest for a guy whose reputation wasn't always such. The book, which he wrote with Keith Elliott Greenberg, was voted by Observer readers as the best pro wrestling book of 2006. But it at the DVD didn't swell well, and his cut for both was probably around $20,000, and he sent a nasty letter to McMahon believing he deserved $600,000. This is also likely the reason when Sammartino and the WWE made amends that they didn't do the expected Sammartino DVD, because as big a star as Graham was in the 70s, the market for pre-1984 wrestling DVDs and books was thought not to be there from the attempts with Graham and Blassie. He tried making money doing crafts and artwork. Once, as a present, he gave me a painting that has been prominent in my home for decades. Graham was on the Phil Donahue Show in 1992 with myself, Sammartino, McMahon, Barry Orton, Randy's uncle, John Arezzi and others, and on the show claimed to have shot Hulk Hogan with steroids, which McMahon claimed he made up. Hogan was a fan in the audience in Tampa who Graham noticed because he was so tall and the two knew each other, and Hogan wanted to get a body like Graham. Graham at times claimed he didn't tell Hogan about steroids, but Hogan obviously used them to become the next generation of superstar Graham. At other times Graham said that he did advise Hogan about steroids. Also on the show he claimed to have witnessed Pat Patterson sexually abuse a young boy. In his book, When trying to be honest, he called it my most shameful moment, not only in the wrestling profession, but in my life. At one point he wrote apologies to Hogan, Patterson, and even McMahon for his behavior. Patterson never wanted to speak with him. He and Hogan ended up on good terms. He and McMahon had ups and downs over the years. Eventually, he made amends with Vince McMahon in 2004 and was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. They talked about doing a book and a DVD, which he hoped would make him some money. Triple H inducted Graham, talking about how Graham inspired him and reciting lines from Graham's famous interviews that he had memorized. There were issues over the years. Graham was vehement after the death of Eddie Guerrero when he found out that WWE was not going to invite any members of the Guerrero family to his Hall of Fame induction. He caused enough of a stink around the WWE with everyone he could talk with, being adamant that his friends Chavo, Mondo, and Hector, as well as Eddie's sisters and the family, be invited. In the end, all were invited. Graham had, in 2005, presided over Eddie Guerrero's funeral. At the time, Graham had reserved a burial spot at the Green Acres Cemetery in Scottsdale, Arizona, next to Guerrero. The funeral at one point led to rifts with McMahon and Chris Jericho some time later. Graham was presiding over it and giving everyone time cues, and Jericho, who was very close with Guerrero and probably had the best speech of the night, was not going to be limited to 5 minutes. At some point Jericho joked about Graham trying to limit his time, and Graham literally went crazy on him verbally. It was a sad display. Late in the funeral, which was going long as Graham continued to talk emotionally about Guerrero, Vince McMahon made a comment about it being long. Graham felt that making that comment while he was speaking about hurrying up was in bad taste. Graham was told that with the book and DVD, he would be brought back as a regular TV character, but after basically a quick cameo or two it never happened. He became friends with Dave Bautista, and wanted to be his manager and mentor. But that never happened. His WWE salary, about $2,000 a month, was basically the cost of his medications he needed after his liver transplant. Eventually he was let go from that position, sold his Hall of Fame ring on eBay to pay medical bills, and then demanded to be taken out of the Hall of Fame, as he turned on the company, and for whatever reason, was furious they inducted Abdullah the Butcher, who hadn't worked for the company and had infected Graham's friend Devin Nicholson with hepatitis. At first he spoke out against Linda McMahon when running for Senate in 2010, claiming she allowed racy programming on WWE shows watched to large amounts of children in the Attitude Era. Then he apologized and offered to be a spokesperson for Linda's campaign. He was heavily criticized for asking for a job as a promo coach so shortly after the death of Dusty Rhodes. But he and the company reconciled again, and he had been under a Legends deal since 2015.